The taiga in autumn was not merely a forest. It was an ancient, breathing entity, a vastness where the gold of pine needles collided with a leaden sky, and silence was a tangible thing, broken only by the distant crack of a branch under a paw or the lonely cry of a bird. In this realm, Ivan the gamekeeper moved as another creature of the deep woods. His face was a map of his life, carved by wind and frost. His hands were broad and scarred, familiar with the grain of an axe handle and the soft fur of a newborn hare. His cabin, a fortress of notched logs and stubbornness, stood a solid 20 kilometers from the nearest whisper of civilization, a logging outpost that was deserted more often than not. He preferred it that way. The company of wolves, the cautious exchange of glances with a lynx, the honest hunger of the wilderness, these were relationships he understood. People were a complication, a noise he had consciously left behind years ago. His days followed the sun and the habits of the animals he watched over. That morning, he had been tracking a family of boar, not to hunt, but to ensure they were staying clear of the old poacher's trails. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet decay of mushrooms and the sharp scent of pine resin. It was on his way back, following the familiar ribbon of the Black River, that the taiga whispered a discordant note. The birds had fallen silent along a stretch of the old wolf run. Not the alert silence of a predator's passing, but a deeper, watchful hush. At first, his eyes, trained to see the broken pattern, dismissed it as a windfall of birch trunks tangled with storm-wrecked undergrowth. But a splash of unnatural color, a vibrant, synthetic blue, caught the gray and amber landscape like a wound. He froze, his breath pluming in the cold air. Slowly, hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle slung over his shoulder, he moved closer. It was not a tangle of wood. It was a human form, curled tightly into a fetal position against the massive, mossy trunk of a fallen cedar. The blue was a jacket, expensive-looking but now torn to ribbons, snagged by claws that were not from any branch. A backpack, empty and gashed open, lay a few feet away. Ivan approached as he would a wounded animal, with deliberate, non-threatening slowness, his boots making soft, deliberate crunches on the frost. He was 10 paces away when she stirred. A low, guttural sound escaped her, not a word, but a vibration of pure terror. She uncoiled slightly, revealing a face so pale it seemed to glow against the dark moss. It was streaked with dirt and old tears, her eyes sunken pools of pure animal fear. She tried to scramble back, but her body betrayed her, a shudder of weakness racking her frame. "Napodkoti," she rasped, the command a brittle, dry-leaf whisper. "Don't come closer." Ivan stopped, assessing her with a practiced, impersonal gaze. The shallow, rapid breath. The dried blood on her temple. The way one leg was held stiffly. The deeper, angry red stain seeping through the torn sleeve of her jacket. Infection, maybe a day or two old. "I already have," he said, his voice low and calm, the voice of the forest itself. "There's nowhere further to go. The wolves have already taken your scent. I can feel it." He wasn't trying to frighten her, it was a simple statement of fact. The air did carry that particular electric tension, the quiet before the feast. The woman, a girl, really, he thought, despite the lines of suffering on her face, stared at him, her mind fighting through a fog of exhaustion and fear. Something in his steady, unalarmed presence, in the sheer solidity of him, seemed to pierce the panic. Her story spilled out in broken fragments between chattering teeth. Anya. From the city. A solo trek, a foolish bet with herself, a desire to find silence. She'd gotten disoriented 3 days ago, her map useless in the endless, repeating corridors of trees. She'd stumbled upon a bear at a salmon run, a frantic, blind run through thickets had left her scratched, lost, and without her supplies, which she'd dropped in her flight. The on her shoulder was from a fall against a sharp branch, not the bear, but it burned with a fever of its own. Ivan listened, nodding once or twice. Words were costly out here, he saved them. Without another word, he shrugged off his heavy pack, pulled out his flask of strong, sweet tea, still lukewarm, and held it out. She stared at it, then at his impassive face, before snatching it with trembling hands, drinking in desperate gulps. While she drank, he swiftly unpacked a thick wool blanket. "The cabin is 6 kilometers, he stated. "You can't walk it like that." Before she could protest, he had moved. With a surprising gentleness in such a large man, he scooped her up, blanket and all. She was as light as a hollow-boned bird. She gave one weak, token struggle, a final flare of primal resistance, then went utterly still, a small, broken thing against the vast, weathered canvas of his coat. She turned her face into the rough wool of his telegrika, which smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, bitter juniper, and a steadfast, undeniable life. He carried her not like a princess, but like a precious, fragile piece of the forest he was responsible for, a fallen nestling, a fawn separated from its mother. The 6-kilometer trek back to his izba was a silent, arduous journey. Ivan moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his breathing even, his senses extended to the woods around them. He felt her fever through the blanket, heard her occasional, pained whimper when he adjusted his grip. The taiga watched them pass, and for once, Ivan felt its gaze not as a familiar pressure, but as a judgment. Had he grown soft, bringing this strand of the chaotic outside world into its heart? When the small, sturdy cabin came into view, smoke curling placidly from its chimney, it felt like a victory. He shouldered the door open and brought her into the single room, laying her gently on the broad wooden bench by the colossal brick pechka, the heart of the home. He stoked the fire until the heat radiated in visible waves, then set about his work with methodical efficiency. He cleaned her wounds with a clear, stinging alcohol made from pine needles, his touch firm but not unkind. He prepared a bitter, pungent decoction of rosehips, wild rosemary, and other roots, holding her head up to make her drink it. She gagged but swallowed, her eyes never leaving his face, wide with a new kind of awe. As the deep, medicinal warmth spread through her and the savage shivering subsided, a fragile peace descended. She slept for 18 hours, and Ivan sat watch in his rough-hewn chair, mending his nets, listening to her breathe. When she awoke, it was to the smell of fish soup, ukka, bubbling in a pot, the rich scent of onions and river trout filling the cabin. Her gratitude in those first conscious hours was a quiet, overwhelming force. It was in the way her eyes followed him, brimming with unspoken thanks. It was in the tears that silently tracked through the grime on her cheeks when he handed her a bowl of soup and a hunk of coarse bread. She began to talk, haltingly at first, then in a slow, relieved stream. She spoke of a life of glass and concrete, of the hum of computers and the sting of a personal betrayal she couldn't outrun. She had fled to the taiga seeking a silence so absolute it would drown out the noise in her head, and instead, she had found a roaring, indifferent void that had nearly swallowed her whole. Ivan listened, mostly looking into the fire. He spoke little, but his silence wasn't empty, it was receptive. Over the days that followed, as her strength returned in increments, the dynamic shifted subtly. He began to show her his world, not as a terrifying trap, but as a complex, living home. He pointed out the subtle sign of a hare's path, the meaning behind different bird calls, how to find the sweetest lingonberries under their leathery leaves. One clear, freezing night, he pointed through the small window at a brilliant spray of stars unseen in the city's glow. "Vot, see that bright one? That's not a star. That's Jupiter. And that smudge there, that's the Andromeda Galaxy. Another world, bigger than ours, just hanging there." Anya looked from the impossible vastness outside to the solid, quiet man beside her. The awe in her eyes softened, the pure terror replaced by a dawning, humble wonder. And in that wonder, something else flickered, a warm, living light of connection, of seeing not just her savior, but the man. Ivan, feeling the weight of that gaze, would gruffly turn back to stoking the fire, but the lines around his eyes, usually etched by squinting into distances, seemed to relax just a little. The cabin, for so long a place of purposeful solitude, now held a new sound, the murmur of a human voice, not as an intrusion, but as a part of its ancient, echoing song. The silence that settled over the izba after the helicopter's thrum faded was of a different quality than before. It was no longer the deep, contented silence of self-sufficiency, but a hollow, echoing one. Ivan stood for a long time on the porch, the chill of late autumn seeping through his clothes, staring at the scar in the sky where the machine had been. The taiga seemed to exhale around him, reclaiming its sonic territory with the rustle of a million needles and the distant chuckle of the river. But to Ivan, it felt less like a homecoming and more like an abandonment. He tried to slip back into his rhythms. He checked his traps, repaired the fence around his small vegetable plot now sleeping under a blanket of frost, and patrolled his sector. But his focus was fractured. In the creak of the floorboards, he heard her hesitant steps. In the crackle of the fire, he heard her voice, soft with wonder as she asked about the stars. The cabin, once a perfect vessel for his solitude, now seemed clumsily large, filled with ghosts of conversation. He found a hairpin, a tiny silver thing, wedged between the floorboards near the bench where she'd slept. He picked it up, its cool metal absurdly delicate in his calloused palm, and instead of throwing it into the fire, he placed it on the rough-hewn shelf above the table, next to a hawk's feather and a perfectly round river stone. The memory of her embrace, sudden, fierce, and human, lingered like a brand. He had frozen for a second, his arms awkward at his sides, before that one, clumsy pat on her back. He had told her. Live. It was the only blessing he knew how to give. And now, he felt the irony of it. She had returned to life, to the world of noise and people, and she had taken a piece of his own quiet vitality with her. The loneliness he had once worn like a well-fitted coat now chafed, raw and uncomfortable. Weeks bled into the monochrome grip of November. The first serious snows came, not the gentle flakes of early winter, but a horizontal, howling fury that sculpted the landscape into new, severe forms. The taiga became a minimalist sketch in white and charcoal. Ivan's world shrunk to the circle of heat from his pechka and the daily struggle to maintain his paths. He told himself he was waiting for spring. But in truth, he was simply waiting, a state foreign to his nature. The day of the great blizzard, the Buran, was the pinnacle of this isolating season. The wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, hurling fistfuls of ice against the windows. The world beyond the thick glass was a swirling, white void. It was a day for mending gear, for rereading his handful of dog-eared books, for stew and silence. The storm was so loud it created its own kind of quiet, a roar that drowned out all thought. Which is why the sound, when it came, was so impossible that Ivan dismissed it as a trick of the wind. A rhythmic, dull thump-thump-thump. He paused, a needle held over a torn fishing net. It came again, unmistakable now. Not the wind. A knock. On his door. His blood went still, colder than the ice outside. No one. No one came here in summer, let alone in a Buran. It had to be a hallucination born of solitude, or something from the old tales, a forest spirit, a leshy playing tricks. He stood, moving silently to the door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bolt. The knock came a third time, more insistent. He drew the bolt and pulled the door open against the wind's resistance. A figure stood on his threshold, bundled into an amorphous shape of fur and snow, face wrapped in a thick scarf, eyes just visible between a hat and the wool. Behind them, nearly swallowed by the whiteout, was the vague outline of a sani, a traditional sled, hitched not to a reindeer, but to a single, sturdy-looking horse, its head bowed against the storm. The sani were piled with boxes. For a long moment, they just stared at each other through the stinging curtain of snow. Then, the figure wrestled a mittened hand free and pulled down the scarf. It was Anya. Her face was flushed with cold and exertion, her eyelashes starred with ice crystals, but her eyes, those were the same. Not haunted and terrified as they had been by the river, but alive, clear, and lit from within by a fierce, joyous determination. I couldn't, she shouted over the wind's howl, her breath pluming between them. I tried to go back, Ivan. I tried to just say thank you and leave. But a thank you felt like a coin tossed to a beggar. It wasn't enough. It wasn't right. Ivan was paralyzed, his mind unable to process this apparition. He stepped back wordlessly, a mute invitation. She turned and shouted something to the horse, a command lost in the gale, then began hauling one of the boxes from the sled, struggling with its weight. Instinct broke his stupor. He pushed past her into the blizzard, the cold a physical slap, and between the two of them, they wrestled the heavy, tarpaulin-covered boxes into the relative warmth of the cabin, stacking them by the wall. The horse, a patient, shaggy creature, stood stoically as Ivan then led it to the lean-to shelter beside the woodshed. When he finally stomped back inside, sealing the world of white fury behind him, Anya was unwrapping herself. She shed layers of fur and wool, revealing the same woman, yet fundamentally altered. There was a new solidity to her posture, a calm in her movements that spoke of purpose, not panic. The cabin was now filled with the strange, quiet energy of her presence and the mute mystery of the boxes. Ivan leaned against the door, arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. She met his gaze, a small smile playing on her lips. "You said you'd read everything here, to holes. You showed me your bookshelf. Dostoevsky with the spine gone, that atlas from the 60s. Your world is vast out here, Ivan, but your thoughts need more than just pine trees to chew on." She walked to the nearest box, sliced the tape with a knife from his table, and folded back the flaps. It was filled with books. Not just a handful. Dozens. Hardbacks and paperbacks, their spines a mosaic of color and promise. She opened another box. More books. Histories, volumes of poetry, novels by authors he'd never heard of, beautiful albums of art from museums in cities whose names were like fairy tales to him. "This is the first part," she said, her voice softer now, filled with emotion. "This is how I start to thank you. Not with money you have no use for. But with windows. Windows to other worlds, for when the winter is long." Ivan approached slowly, as if the boxes might contain something volatile. He reached out and picked up a heavy volume, a collection of landscapes by Russian painters. He opened it randomly to a reproduction of a Shishkin forest, a monumental, sun-drenched pine wood that made his own world outside look like a sketch. The smell of new paper and ink was alien and intoxicating. He was utterly disarmed. "This is too much," he managed to say, his voice rough. "It's not all," Anya said. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for the most important part. "I quit my job. The one that was suffocating me. I sold my apartment in the city. The money. I used it to buy the old forestry house, the one on the edge of the village, 20 kilometers from here. It has a good roof and a big stove. The village needs a teacher for their 6 children. I'm going to be that teacher." The implications unfolded in Ivan's mind like a map. She wasn't just visiting. She wasn't a temporary ghost. She was planting herself at the edge of his world. Why? The word escaped him, bare and essential. Her smile widened, becoming something radiant that seemed to push back the gloom of the storm outside. "Because you taught me that silence isn't about being alone. It's about being present. You saved me from the taiga, and then you showed me its soul. You gave me a gift I could never repay with a simple spasibo. So I'm not repaying it. I'm sharing it. I'll have my life, with the children, the village. But I'll also have this." She gestured to the window, to the wildness beyond. "And you'll have your silence, your woods. But maybe now, you won't have to be so alone in it. Unless you don't want a neighbor." She finished, her confidence momentarily giving way to a flicker of vulnerability. She was offering him not intrusion, but adjacency. Not obligation, but possibility. She had understood the deepest law of the taiga: everything exists in balance, in relationship. She was not trying to fill his silence, she was offering a different kind of quiet, one that could hold the echo of a friendly voice across the miles. Ivan turned away abruptly, busying himself with the samovar on the bench, pumping the bellows, hiding the overwhelming rush of feeling that threatened to crack his stony composure. It wasn't just gratitude.